The bells began before the light had properly fallen, when the sky still carried the last reluctant colour of day. They moved across the air like some half-remembered hymn, indistinct yet insistent, a sound belonging less to faith than to the stone that held it. I remember pausing beneath the limes along the Broad, the leaves shivering in a half-hearted breeze, and thinking how Oxford has always preferred echo to silence. It was then, at the corner of the newsagents, that I saw the headline, nothing bold, nothing desperate, merely a single column with the quiet authority of death. Professor Julian Harborough, eminent Fellow of St. Jude's, found dead in his room. A heart complaint, the text suggested, no hint of scandal, yet the line was underlined in my mind like the suspicious neatness of a crossword clue whose answer was not yet clear. I told myself I had no interest, a retired professor, past his prime, past most things, yet even as I stood, coins in my hand for a packet of cigarettes, I felt the peculiar unease that comes when a word is spelt wrongly and nobody notices. St. Jude's, austere, slightly decayed, was not the sort of college that bred dramatic exits. Harborough's lectures, so I recalled, had been dutifully attended by a handful of weary undergraduates who knew that literature, however deeply admired, seldom paid the bills. I had sat in the back once, years ago, when curiosity led me in through the heavy doors. His voice then had been steady, his arguments exact. I found myself wondering what became of all that precision, where it goes when the heart decides it has had enough. Strange called me the following morning. The official tone was meant to conceal the eagerness I knew too well. Natural causes, he said, though there are murmurs. I asked what kind of murmurs. He coughed his way of admitting interest without responsibility. A colleague thought Harborough had appeared distracted. Another claimed he had been working obsessively on a final lecture. And then a misquotation so minor a thing, yet mentioned with the faint relish of gossip. It was this, not the death itself, that drew me. A misquotation is like a misplaced bishop in chess. It might mean nothing, but equally it may conceal the entire strategy. The paper said Arnold, but Arnold never wrote the line as given. Memory betrays us all in time, but Harborough had been meticulous, too meticulous. I thought of the professor at his desk, his books arranged as armour, and imagined him copying words he knew by heart, only to alter them by choice or necessity. I lit a cigarette and watched the smoke drift into the rain-stained air, knowing that whatever he had been trying to say, death had closed the sentence. Lewis asked me that evening whether we would take it further. He had the solid patience of a man who preferred facts to suggestions, evidence to shadows. I told him perhaps we ought to look, if only to be certain there was nothing there. He smiled in that weary way of his, already resigned to the hours he would spend chasing what might prove no more than my instinct. But instinct is all we ever have at the beginning. Later, alone, I poured myself a whiskey and unfolded the crossword. The clue that caught me was the short, final sound in church, 3 letters. I considered the answer while the bells of St. Jude's drifted faintly through memory, their persistence outlasting the day. End, of course, too obvious, almost lazy, yet it was there, inscribed with the indifference of truth. The end. And so it began. The morning air carried the scent of damp stone and wet leaves, the kind of quiet that presses against the bones and invites reflection rather than action. Strange's summons had been polite, understated, yet the weight behind it was unmistakable. I arrived at St. Jude's College not as a guest but as an intruder of sorts, moving past gates that seemed to lean slightly inward, as if reluctant to witness what had transpired. The porter barely looked up. Oxford is full of men who have learned to ignore the faint stirrings of trouble, unless it bangs loudly at the door. In the inquest hall, the polished oak benches gleamed under the muted light filtering through leaded windows. The coroner's clerk read aloud a report that claimed natural causes, though the phrasing was careful, almost defensive. There was a footnote, brief, so easily overlooked that one could pass through it without noticing a line in Harborough's final lecture manuscript had been altered. A minor misquotation of Matthew Arnold. The clerk mentioned it as if noting the colour of the curtains, and yet it struck me differently, like a bell struck gently, producing resonance in places not immediately visible. I recalled the lecture room where I had once sat, a thin, cold shaft of light cutting across polished desks, and the meticulousness with which Harborough had organised his notes. He had preferred precision over flourish, exactitude over impression. That footnote was not carelessness, not in him. There was intention, and intention has weight heavier than the body of the crime itself. Lewis arrived behind me, the rhythm of his steps muted, almost apologetic. He had the patience of a man accustomed to waiting for facts to reveal themselves, though he seldom allowed sentiment to cloud his judgment. I noted the way he hesitated by the lectern, his hand brushing against a stray piece of paper. A habitual gesture, I thought, but something in the angle of his fingers, the pause, the slight lift, made me consider whether even routine touches could disclose thought. We moved to the college library, the smell of old paper, binding glue, and wax polish rising in a comforting wave. Among Harborough's collected works I found the marginalia, a subtle rhythm of annotation, ink slightly smudged as if by a hand, shaking not with age but with suppressed urgency. There it was again, that misquoted Arnold, and beneath it, a line erased and rewritten, the new words almost pleading for clarity. The clue was quiet, inconspicuous, like the whisper of a shuttered window. I recognized the act he had been speaking to someone, perhaps even to himself, in a code that assumed familiarity with both the literature and the context of his life. It was over a cup of bitter tea in the shadowed fellow's room that I noticed the detail which first stirred suspicion, the seal on a letter to an academic journal, faintly off-centre. Too small a thing to provoke alarm, yet the imbalance spoke of carelessness or deliberate diversion. I considered it while Lewis rearranged the papers absent-mindedly, unaware that his movements, habitual as they were, could illuminate more than the footnote itself. Returning through the cloisters, the rain had begun again, thin and persistent, forming rivulets across the flagstones. The bell tower tolled, half-heartedly, as if reminding me of time slipping without regard for consequence. And in that sound I heard the echo of the manuscript, the final lecture, and the line that had been altered. Small gestures, subtle inconsistencies, were all pieces of a puzzle that had yet to speak its name. The day ended with the faint melancholy of street lamps reflected on wet cobbles. I lit a cigarette, watching smoke drift into the evening. There was a curious satisfaction in knowing that the footnote, so easily ignored, would be the first thread pulled in a tapestry woven of silence, precision, and careful concealment. And in that quiet I realized that sometimes the smallest annotations carry the loudest truths. I arrived at St. Jude's under a sky the colour of wet pewter, the rain pattering softly against the cloistered walkways, carrying the faint tang of damp stone and distant coal fires. The college seemed particularly withdrawn that afternoon, doors closed, windows curtained, as though the walls themselves were reluctant witnesses. My first visit was to the senior common room, where the remaining fellows gathered in low conversation, polite but guarded, each face a mask honed over years of academic politeness. Harborough's junior lecturer, a man named Selby, was the first to speak, though he hardly raised his eyes from the papers he shuffled. He appeared eager, almost too eager, to discuss Harborough's final lecture, mentioning in passing that the professor had been preoccupied with the structure of argument in ways that struck even his colleagues as unusual. There was a slight tremor in his hands, and I noticed it, not as a sign of nervousness but of anticipation, the sort that blooms in someone who has long awaited an opportunity, whether for insight or advantage. Next I spoke to Dr. Whitmore, the colleague passed over for promotion, who leaned back in his chair with the care of a man accustomed to defeat. He mentioned the professor's obsessive work habits, and the subtle bitterness in his voice suggested an attachment beyond professional disappointment. A certain curling of the lips, almost imperceptible, hinted at long-held resentments buried beneath scholarly civility. I made a note of it not to indict, but to catalogue human frailty, as any observer must. Then there was Eleanor Harborough, whose presence seemed to draw light from the dim room, though she kept her gaze fixed on a cup of tea as if its contents contained the answer to some private riddle. Her comments were measured, and yet in the inflection of her voice I caught a hesitation, a fraction of a second, where the expected cadence faltered. It was subtle, the kind of detail most would overlook, but in her I perceived a mind at work, a careful weighing of words before surrendering them. I filed that observation with the others, knowing it would prove useful in time. The librarian, Mr. Halloway, was more reticent, his eyes tracking the movements of those around him rather than engaging directly. I watched as his hand lingered over a shelf of Harborough's personal volumes. He did not speak, yet his posture, the slight tilt of his head, betrayed a devotion to routine and a quiet suspicion of strangers. I remembered my own observations of such men in years past. The silent custodians of knowledge often hold keys to truths unspoken. I wandered briefly through the lecture hall again, noting the placement of desks and the alignment of chairs, as though the arrangement itself might suggest preference or omission. A scribbled margin note on a blackboard forgotten by cleaning staff caught my eye. An abbreviation, merely 2 letters, underlined. I lingered over it, feeling a spark of recognition, as though it might illuminate some hidden logic in the interpersonal geometry of the fellows. Returning to the common room, I sipped a weak tea and reflected on the subtle interplay among these scholars. They were intelligent, certainly, each mind capable of nuance and deduction, yet each flawed by desire, regret, or ambition. The professor's absence had left a vacuum that revealed not only hidden resentments, but the quiet longing for acknowledgement that drives even the most accomplished intellects. Before leaving, I noticed Selby's left hand fidgeting with the cuff of his jacket, the sleeve slightly frayed. Yet the watch he wore was precise, deliberate, incongruous with the casual manner he projected. I committed the detail to memory, a small sign that might flicker into meaning later, like the quiet half-syllable at the end of a stanza that changes the interpretation of the entire poem. Stepping back into the rain-soaked cloisters, I felt the weight of observation pressing gently, not as accusation, but as the slow and certain accumulation of understanding. The circle of scholars was complete, each orbiting its own secret, and I, for the moment, remained an outsider, looking in, listening, and noting what others assumed was invisible. The afternoon had the damp insistence of early November, the streets slick and glimmering, the smell of rain on stone mingling with faint smoke from domestic chimneys. I found Eleanor Harborough in the drawing-room of the old house she shared with memories more stubborn than the furniture, the light filtering through lace curtains giving her a quiet, spectral glow. She looked up from the embroidery she had been pretending to concentrate on, and her smile was there, fleeting, deliberate, yet impossible to read entirely. It was a careful construction, not warmth, but a signal, as if she were inviting observation without revealing allegiance. She spoke of the loss with practiced restraint, describing her husband as devoted, intense, and at times impossibly meticulous. I listened more than I responded, noting the slight pause before she said devoted, the subtle rise and fall of her voice, almost imperceptible. The room smelled faintly of tea, of polished wood, of books not recently handled but still alive in their familiarity. Each of these small details, unnoticed by many, seemed to pulse quietly, urging attention. There was a photograph on the mantelpiece, Harborough at a lecture, arm raised mid-gesture, the shadow of the lectern crossing his face. Eleanor's hand lingered near it as she spoke, and I noticed the slight tremor, a gesture unacknowledged but revealing. I wondered whether it was sorrow or something older, a residue of emotion tightly contained. She mentioned casually that Harborough had been particularly concerned with an essay due to be published posthumously, the implication of completion lingering between us. She did not elaborate on the nature of his concern, yet the careful selection of words suggested she knew more than she chose to reveal. I remarked upon a book left open on a side table, one of Harborough's own editions of Arnold, and she allowed herself a glance toward it, noting its margin notes. Her fingers brushed a passage, hesitating, the slightest flicker of recognition in her expression. I recorded it, not in words but in the quiet ledger of perception one carries silently, the almost imperceptible signals that speak louder than the most impassioned declarations. Lewis, who had followed behind me, commented on the library catalogues that Harborough had consulted in the final weeks, trying to construct the chain of references for his lecture. Eleanor's attention flicked, subtle but unmistakable, and I caught a micro-expression of awareness, perhaps of concern, perhaps of regret. It passed too quickly to name, but not too quickly to notice. These are the gestures that accumulate, hinting at truths concealed beneath careful civility. We moved to the piano in the corner, a tall, dark instrument, its polished surface reflecting the grey light like a mirror of another time. Eleanor's hand hovered above the keys, not playing, merely poised, and I noted the precision of the gesture, the way her fingers curved just so, as if rehearsed from memory. It was a momentary tableau, insignificant to any casual observer, yet to me it suggested control, a careful management of presence and emotion that mirrored the unreadable smile she maintained throughout. As she spoke of the evenings she had spent alone with Harborough, I noticed a faint discordance in her phrasing, a word chosen too precisely, a pause that might have been natural but felt rehearsed. I considered her daily routines, the timing of her letters, the exact order of meals, all recorded meticulously in my mind, as if preparing a map of intention and circumstance. There was one detail, slightly yet persistent, the way she set down her teacup, the exact angle, the slow rotation before placing it on the saucer. A small gesture, unnoticed by most, but in the context of the day, it suggested deliberate thought, a cadence of behavior that might reveal more than words ever could. I left Eleanor Harborough that evening with the quiet ache of suspicion tempered by admiration. Her smile lingered in memory, a cipher, elegant and controlled, hinting at confidences I could only begin to guess at. Walking back along the rain-slick streets, the bells of St. Jude's faintly tolling in the distance, I understood that the truth, like the final note of a carefully measured sonata, might emerge only after patience, reflection, and the subtle tracing of the almost imperceptible signs left by those who know how to conceal, as artfully as they reveal. The Bodleian had that familiar dusty hush that always makes one feel at once humble and conspicuous, as if the walls themselves were judging the purpose of your presence. I had returned there alone, leaving Lewis to pursue the mundane aspects of inquiry, for I knew that the more delicate clues would not announce themselves to anyone who demanded evidence in the ordinary way. The smell of paper, glue, and old leather rose in slow, intoxicating waves, mingling with the faint chill of stone corridors. I moved along the stacks, letting the shadows settle about me, searching among Harbour's personal volumes. It was a small, nondescript book, a well-thumbed edition of Matthew Arnold, that first drew my attention. The leather was scuffed, corners softened by years of handling, and the spine faintly cracked. There, on the flyleaf, was an inscription, one I had not expected to JH for all the final lectures. The handwriting was precise, measured, almost ceremonious, yet not his own. I traced the letters with a finger gloved against both cold and intrusion, noting the slight tilt, the even spacing, the flourish on the H. Someone had written this for humour to him, and I could not yet discern which. The librarian, Halloway, appeared silently from between two stacks, a man whose quiet vigilance I had long admired. He mentioned, without prompting, that Harbour had recently borrowed texts on obscure poisons. The words hung in the air, faint, almost imperceptible, yet somehow significant. Not enough to accuse, merely enough to nudge the mind into consideration, like a minor chord that hints at dissonance beneath the melody. I filed the detail, knowing that observation without assertion is often the first step to understanding. I opened the volume, noting the margins, the underlined passages, the tiny annotations that a man so meticulous could not have left to chance. One line was altered, the words rewritten in a manner both subtle and deliberate, the ink a slightly different shade from the rest. I considered the act, the time it must have taken, the consciousness required to choose one word over another. The thought occurred that this was not simply scholarship, but a message left carefully in a medium designed to be studied yet overlooked. A noise startled me, a footstep too soft, a shadow cast by the tall shelves. I looked up to see a student retreating as if caught between curiosity and duty. I considered the brief hesitation, the tilt of the head, the way the hand rested on the spine of a volume. Small gestures, easily dismissed, yet capable of betraying intentions when accumulated with others. I recalled Selby's tremor when discussing the final lecture, Eleanor's fleeting micro-expressions, the subtle discord in Whitmore's phrasing. The inscription, I realized, was another such trace, a delicate hint of motive or caution, or both. I lingered over the book, inhaling the scent of vellum and thought, reflecting on how words, once committed to paper, can persist longer than their author, and can hold secrets that speak to the attentive reader long after the voice has been silenced. The inscription, so polite and measured, was a key not to a door, but to a perception, a subtle framing of truth that demanded patience and reflection rather than forceful intrusion. Stepping into the sunlight that had begun to pierce the upper windows, I felt the small thrill of recognition. It is in such minor, overlooked details, the slight tilt of a letter, a margin note, the choice of a phrase that the mind finds its first flickers of illumination. Harbour had left a trace, imperceptible to all but the attentive observer. I returned the volume to its shelf, noting the angle at which the inscription caught the light, and for the first time I felt a faint clarity, a slender thread connecting the scholar, the inscription, and the secret he had intended to convey. I remember sitting in the dim corner of my flat that evening, the rain tapping a steady rhythm against the window, the glow from the street lamps pooling across the worn carpet like molten gold. Lewis had gone to check the college archives, leaving me to the company of half-smoked cigarettes, the faint tang of whiskey, and a crossword puzzle whose clues seemed unusually obstinate that night. It was the sort of quiet that encourages thought to wander, to drift among details otherwise unnoticed, and I allowed myself that indulgence. The crossword itself held a peculiar resonance. One clue, finality of church, 6 letters whispered insistently in my mind. I wrote the letters slowly, considering each possibility. Ending, coda, requiem. Requiem seemed apt, echoing with more than mere semantics, a musical reference, the sort of elegant layer Harborough might have appreciated. The clue was not merely diversion, it was metaphor, aligning strangely with the unfinished lecture and the incomplete narratives left by his death. I turned my thoughts to the financial records I had glimpsed earlier that day. Harborough's will had been revised quietly, with Selby benefiting in ways that seemed disproportionate to his tenure. A logical deduction might suggest ambition as motive, yet ambition rarely leaves the faint fingerprints of subtlety. I considered the timing, the careful execution, and the juxtaposition with Eleanor's measured composure. Something was slightly off, a misalignment between what the world expected and what reality permitted. At the college, the small gestures I had observed began to coalesce. Whitmore's clipped explanations, Eleanor's careful hand movements, and Selby's tremor when recounting lectures were all minor, almost invisible, like brushstrokes across a canvas of suspicion. My attention returned to the crossed words on the page before me, each letter a lattice connecting shadow to shadow. I noted how the pattern, the intersections, seemed to mirror human relationships overlapping, concealed alignments, the occasional misstep that betrays intention. I recalled a minor detail overlooked in our first examination of the lecture manuscripts. A quotation misattributed not once but twice, a subtle but deliberate twisting of meaning. The lines were familiar yet skewed, as if pointing to a coded emphasis, a minor discord amid scholarly propriety. I underlined it in my own notebook, aware that in matters of intellect the slight anomalies are more illuminating than the obvious. Lewis returned, wet from the streets, and remarked casually on the state of the library inventories, noting an unusual borrowing pattern among junior fellows. I watched his hand as he adjusted his coat sleeve, a habitual gesture, and it struck me that even such banal movements carry meaning when observed in concert with other evidence. He did not notice, and that was fortunate. The mind records what the world ignores. Later, I wandered to the piano in the corner of my flat, tapping the keys absent-mindedly, allowing the quiet resonance to echo the rhythm of thought. Music, like words, can reveal patterns unnoticed, and the faint harmony or dissonance sometimes illuminates the relationships among people better than any direct observation. I thought of Harborough, of his careful edits, the borrowed texts on poisons, the footnote misquotation, and the way small discrepancies in human behavior, fidgeting hands, delayed glances can speak volumes. By the time the rain had ceased, leaving the streets polished and reflective, I had traced an unseen lattice of motives and subtle truths. The crossed words of my puzzle, the underlined letters, the misquoted passages, and the gestures of scholars converged into something almost tangible. Yet it remained unresolved, a promise rather than a conclusion, a faint melody hinting at a truth that required patience, attention, and the slow unravelling of human pride and secrecy. The lecture hall was deserted when I returned, the damp light from the high windows falling in slanted rectangles across the polished desks. The air carried the faint smell of chalk dust and old wood polish, mingling with the memory of voices that had long since dispersed. I moved slowly along the aisles, noting the faint impressions left by chairs that had been shifted, papers forgotten, a single pencil lying askew. It was in this quiet that I first read the final lecture in its entirety, the words more jagged than I remembered, a familiar cadence fractured by subtle misquotations, one misattributed line from Keats where Arnold had been expected. The alteration was deliberate, of that I was certain. Harborough had been meticulous, he did not err by accident. I traced the passages with my eyes, following the careful underlining and margin notes, the occasional scratch that suggested hesitation, an attempt to adjust meaning. Each revision was like a step on a path, a message obscured in plain sight, the kind of detail that demands patience to interpret. Lewis arrived quietly, his umbrella dripping on the stone floor. He commented on the odd structure of the lecture, noting that a section seemed to reference material decades old, dissertations that few remembered. I observed his hand resting briefly on the podium, a pause that seemed accidental, but revealed a tension in his thought, a reflection of my own unease with the deliberate obscurity of the text. I read the altered passages aloud under my breath, listening for the cadence, the shift in tone, the subtle discord. There was one phrase, rewritten twice, almost pleading for attention, a line about human pride and the necessity of concealment. I remembered Eleanor's gestures, her smile, her careful management of tone. A connection flickered, a momentary, almost imperceptible recognition that suggested the lecture, the misquotations, and the margins were not simply academic exercises, but a conversation with someone who understood more than they admitted. On the back page, I discovered a small, overlooked annotation, a single word scrawled faintly, "Observe." I leaned closer, noting the way the ink had bled slightly, perhaps from a hurried hand, perhaps deliberately to attract attention to those subtle discrepancies. My mind returned to Selby's tremor, Whitmore's clipped explanations, and Eleanor's micro-expressions. It was as though Harborough had constructed the lecture to reveal his final understanding, encoded in careful misdirection, leaving the attentive observer to discern the hidden pattern. I paused to consider the implications, sipping lukewarm tea from a thermos I had brought along. The structure of the lecture, the altered quotations, and the minor inconsistencies were clues to human behavior, to pride and secrecy, more than to academic content. It was all deliberate, a small puzzle meant for perception rather than action, a quiet test of discernment. A faint noise made me glance toward the doorway, the shadow of a student retreating hastily, hands in pockets, shoulders hunched against both curiosity and social caution. The gesture, almost imperceptible, revealed more than any spoken words. It was the unconscious acknowledgement of the patterns I had begun to trace, a subtle reinforcement that observation requires patience. I left the lecture hall slowly, the last rays of sun touching the spines of the bookshelves like faint brushstrokes. Outside, the rain had begun again, a soft, persistent drizzle over the cobblestones. I thought of the rewritten lecture as a carefully constructed reflection, an intricate lattice of human pride, secrecy, and coded messages. It would take time, attention, and the patient gathering of small details to unravel the intentions Harborough had left behind. And for now, that was enough, the quiet ache of understanding hovering at the edges of comprehension, incomplete yet compelling. The evening was damp, the sort that leaves Oxford streets glimmering with reflections of gas lamps and passing umbrellas, the air carrying the faint scent of wet stone and distant coal fires. I found myself at a faculty dinner, held in a room warmed more by polished oak and candlelight than by any visible flame. The tables were laid with care, glasses catching the muted illumination, their contents ranging from claret to faintly sweet white. Conversation flowed with the ease of routine, polite and measured, punctuated by occasional laughter that seemed slightly forced. I watched Harborough's colleagues, their faces familiar, yet transformed by the dim light, noting gestures as much as words. Selby poured his wine with a deliberate care that seemed almost theatrical, his fingers brushing the rim of the decanter with a precision born of habit or caution. Whitmore spoke in clipped sentences about the lecture series, his eyes flicking briefly to Eleanor, before he corrected himself, as though even a glance might betray his thoughts. Eleanor herself, seated apart, moved her glass with slow, almost ceremonial grace, a smile lingering faintly on her lips but never reaching her eyes. A toast was proposed, the clink of crystal echoing across the high ceiling. Harborough's absence, though noted, was explained away with murmurs of indisposition, a faint cough of civility that seemed to leave room for suspicion. The wine, so central to the evening, became a kind of signal, each glass a possible vessel for intent, each sip a chance for revelation. I studied the decanter, the slight sediment at the bottom, the faint variation in the hue of claret, and noted that attention to detail often betrays what the eye does not immediately perceive. I considered the theory that had briefly seized our investigation that Harborough had been poisoned, the method elegant and quiet, suited to the subtlety of scholarly rivalry. The idea fits neatly into the narrative of ambition, desire, and minor resentments. Yet the forensic reports revealed nothing, a fact that should have ended the speculation, but, in truth, only sharpened my focus. Red herrings often carry their own lessons, teaching the observer to weigh the obvious against the invisible, to look for patterns beyond the immediately persuasive. Lewis remarked upon the wine's provenance, noting a rare vintage among otherwise ordinary bottles. I observed the casual manner in which the junior fellows handled it, a slight tremor in Selby's wrist when he lifted the glass to his lips. It was insignificant in isolation, yet in combination with small inconsistencies elsewhere, misquoted lines, altered notes, and subtle gestures, it suggested a network of attention and avoidance that demanded patience to untangle. The minor observations accumulated: a napkin folded with precision, a slight hesitation before responding to a toast, the tilt of a glass when set back on the table. Each seemed innocuous, a product of social training, yet in the context of a murder investigation they acquired gravity, faint signals pointing to truths not yet articulated. I sipped my own wine, allowing its bitter warmth to anchor thought, considering how easily human pride and fear can conceal intention and how elegantly even deception can mimic civility. By the end of the evening, the laughter had faded, the candles guttering slightly, casting long, wavering shadows. I left the room with the echo of clinks and murmurs still in my mind, aware that the red herrings of wine had performed their function, distracting, misleading, yet illuminating patterns in the habits and hesitations of those who might know more than they admitted. Outside, the rain had returned in soft insistence, and I felt the familiar ache of observation, patient and incomplete, pressing gently against the night. I first saw the photograph while sifting through the archive drawers in St. Jude's College, a place where the air always smelled of old paper, wax polish, and a faint trace of mould that spoke of time pressing insistently against memory. The photograph was loose, tucked behind a ledger, almost forgotten, its corners curling slightly. The black and white image of a younger Harborough, the librarian Halloway, and Eleanor in some unremarkable garden. Yet there was something in the framing, the positioning, that seemed deliberate. My eyes lingered on the slight tilt of Eleanor's head, the faint line of a smile that did not reach her eyes, and Halloway's gaze, which was not directed at Harborough, but subtly at her. I held the photograph, carefully, aware of how much could be suggested by the slightest shift in perspective. It was easy to dismiss as a relic of casual days long past, yet I could not ignore the quiet tension captured in a single frame. I remembered Selby's careful attentiveness at the lecture, Whitmore's clipped tone, and Eleanor's measured gestures, and began to see the faint interconnections between past and present, how the living carry shadows of what has been, often unconsciously, into their actions. Lewis arrived shortly, noting casually the stack of ledgers I had been examining. He commented on the photograph, his tone neutral, as if to avoid drawing my attention, yet his glance lingered longer than necessary. I observed the movement of his fingers as he adjusted his watch, a habitual gesture that often betrayed concentration and reflection. There was a pause in his breathing, almost imperceptible, but sufficient to mark the moment as one of attention, the sort that illuminates small, otherwise forgotten details. I returned the photograph to its drawer, but made a mental note of the arrangement of the figures, the subtle intimacies, and the almost imperceptible tensions conveyed. It struck me that Halloway's proximity to Eleanor in the photograph might not have been a coincidence, and yet the possibility remained that it had no significance at all. I considered how memory distorts, how human attention is selective, and how the context of observation can lend weight to otherwise trivial gestures. Later, at home, I placed the photograph on my desk beside an open notebook, the overlapping images of the faces suggesting relationships I could only infer. I reflected on Eleanor's micro-expressions, her careful management of tone, and the slight tremor in Selby's hand when recounting events. The photograph, misfiled and misplaced, had become a focal point, connecting gestures, glances, and omissions in ways that mere conversation had not. I noticed a small detail that had escaped me at first from Halloway's hand, resting almost casually on the rail behind Eleanor, the fingers slightly spread, the thumb curved delicately, as if the photographer had captured an unconscious sign. It was minor, insignificant in isolation, yet in the context of all I had observed, it flickered like a candle against shadow, hinting at loyalties, desires, and concealed motives. The rain had returned, tapping the window panes, and the lamp on my desk cast long shadows across the photograph and notebook. The air smelled faintly of ink and paper, a reminder that the past remains with us, quietly shaping perception. I leaned back in my chair, tracing with my eyes the small gestures, the faint glances, and the details only a photograph could capture. I knew then, with that slow, certain ache that accompanies reflection, that misplacement is often deliberate, and that what is lost or hidden may be more revealing than what is plainly visible. I first discovered the torn page in Harbour's study, a fragment almost invisible amid the clutter of manuscripts and well-used books. The room smelled faintly of cedar polish, of tea long cooled, and of the old paper that carries time within its fibres. Sunlight filtered weakly through the curtains, casting muted rectangles on the floor, and I noticed at once the peculiar way the edges of the page had been to deliberate, yet uneven, as if a hand both hurried and hesitant had acted. The text was fragmentary, a whisper of thought interrupted, mentioning a final lecture, a truth too weighty to bear, and a fear of exposure. Lewis, who had followed me quietly, remarked on the neatness of the desk, the order amidst the chaos, and I observed the way he adjusted the cuff of his coat before reaching for the drawer. A habitual gesture, perhaps, yet his eyes lingered on the torn page, longer than necessary, betraying curiosity restrained by method. The act of noticing, I thought, is as revealing as any confession. One must attend to the minor reactions that unfold almost imperceptibly. I traced the surviving words with my finger, noting the deliberate selection of verbs, the phrasing, the rhythm. Harbour had been attempting to encode a final message, not for publication, but for anyone sufficiently attentive to recognize the subtext. The page spoke of pride, betrayal, and the delicate management of human error, suggesting that the danger he perceived lay not in academic rivalry, but in the revelation of personal indiscretions long concealed. My attention shifted to the desk itself, the arrangement of letters, papers, and inkpots, each positioned as if to mislead the casual observer. There was a letter half open, its seal intact, and I noted a subtle crease in the corner that suggested it had been opened and replaced hurriedly, the hand responsible perhaps pausing mid-action to weigh the consequence. It was in such minutiae that the character of intention reveals itself, a language unspoken yet legible to the patient eye. I recalled Eleanor's measured smiles, Selby's tremor, and Whitmore's clipped explanations, juxtaposing them against the fragmentary content of the page. The unfinished lecture, the misquotations, the margin notes, all became part of a lattice connecting past actions, unspoken knowledge, and concealed motives. Each gesture, each pause, each minor inconsistency flickered in my mind like a half-remembered refrain, resonating in the quiet spaces between certainty and doubt. I placed the fragment under my lamp, the light catching the torn edges and casting faint shadows that suggested continuations the page itself could not provide. There was a faint trace of a fingerprint near the margin, smudged slightly, as if the author had pressed too firmly or hesitated in thought. I considered it carefully, aware that such a small trace might prove illuminating in the larger pattern of attention, deceit, and revelation. Stepping to the window, I looked out at the rain-soaked quadrangle, the cobbles glimmering under the fading light. The quiet ache of observation pressed against the room, a gentle insistence that demanded patience. I realized then that the page, unfinished and fragmentary, was more than a record of fear or confession. It was a carefully poised challenge, an invitation to perceive the subtle interactions of pride, secrecy, and human fallibility that had led to the ultimate silencing of its author. I left the study with the fragment carefully preserved in my notebook, aware that it was a slender thread connecting past intention to present observation. The rain tapped steadily on the stone, a rhythm almost musical in its insistence, and I understood that the meaning of the unfinished page, like the course of human action, would only fully emerge through the patient tracing of gestures, glances, and the minor discrepancies that escape casual attention yet illuminate the truth. The evening was damp and silent, the Oxford streets glimmering faintly under the lamplight, reflections of rain pooling along the flagstones. I walked slowly toward Eleanor Harborough's house, the ache of accumulated observation pressing gently, insistently against my mind. Each detail, each gesture I had noted over the past days seemed now to form an almost imperceptible lattice connecting past intentions with present truths. Her door opened before I could knock, the faint scent of polished wood and lingering tea greeting me as though the house itself were aware of what had been accumulating in shadowed corners. Eleanor greeted me with the same composed smile I had observed countless times before, but this evening there was a hesitation beneath the surface, a micro-expression I would not have caught had I not spent hours tracing the subtle signals of human behavior. She led me to the drawing room, the familiar furniture bathed in the muted glow of a single lamp. The rain outside tapped against the panes like distant applause, punctuating the quiet tension between us. I began to recount the fragments, the misquotations, the altered lecture, the torn page, the photograph, and the small gestures that had guided my attention. Eleanor listened with an elegance that was both composed and evasive, nodding at intervals, her fingers tracing the edge of a teacup, a habitual motion that suggested the careful management of presence. I observed the faint tremor in her hand, imperceptible to most, yet insistent enough to mark the moment as revealing. She spoke softly, not to deny, but to contextualize, her words measured, precise. I noticed the pause before she mentioned Harborough's sedative, the slight inflection that betrayed intention without the need for assertion. The pieces began to settle, a lecture altered not to mislead scholars but to convey a warning, a hidden communication the page tore, not by accident, but to conceal an immediate truth, and her own careful intervention, intended not to harm but to forestall revelation. Each detail fit together with quiet inevitability, as if the logic of human pride and fear had been guiding the sequence all along. I looked at her then, at the controlled grace of her posture, the deliberate calm that masked what must have been considerable apprehension. A small gesture, a slight tilt of the head, the narrowing of an eye confirmed what I had long suspected. Harborough had been silenced not by malice alone, but by the interplay of pride, secrecy, and the attempt to protect what was fragile, human, and emotional. The evidence had not been in a single dramatic act, but scattered across micro-expressions, gestures, and subtle inconsistencies, waiting to be read by someone patient enough to notice. Lewis, who had arrived unnoticed, remarked on the correspondence left in the study, the tone of observation matter-of-fact, yet careful. I noted his hand adjusting his coat, the slight pause in his step, and understood that even he had perceived the contours of the truth without yet articulating it aloud. The quiet unravelling, as it unfolded, was almost musical in its rhythm. Small actions, delayed reactions, measured omissions, converging into a pattern that spoke more eloquently than any direct confession. The rain slowed to a fine drizzle, tapping lightly against the window, and I realized that the resolution was less a conclusion than a recognition. Eleanor's smile softened, no longer a cipher, but a sign of human fragility exposed. As she was led quietly away, the silence of the house seemed to exhale, the shadows retreating into corners previously inhabited by doubt. I stepped out into the night, the bells of St. Jude's faintly tolling, reflecting on how endings are seldom abrupt, how truth often emerges in whispers, and how human pride and secrecy can unfold gently, almost invisibly, until all that remains is observation and understanding.